Welcome to Introduction to Environmental Science Screencasting. Screencasting is an opportunity to look at the slides that go along with your textbook reading and have them narrated by your instructor so that you can better understand some of the highlights and features. Each chapter will have its own series of screencasts, and usually the screencast, there will be more than one for each chapter because the screencast is only about 15 minutes long or less, so we need additional time, additional screencasts. Okay, so each screencast begins with a case study, and if you have edition 1 of our textbook, your case study will be studying the state of the earth, the Neuse River. If you have edition 2, the case study will be about hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Either way, we're not going to cover that in the screencast. That material will be provided for lecture time and discussed in lecture time. So during this particular screencast, I'm going to go through the nuts and bolts of environmental science, an introduction to it, and the most important terms. So we're going to start with the term environment. Let's see if I can bring that up a little better. There we go. Environment. Couple of definitions here. So the environment is a sum of all of the conditions surrounding us that influence life. In particular, environmental science is a field of study that looks at interactions among humans and nature. On the next slide, we'll look at a few more terms that are basic to environmental science. The environment may be divided into two groups, living versus non-living. And the living part is known as the biotic part. Bio means living, such as in biology. So that's a living part of the earth, and it includes animals, plants, and microorganisms. So, for example, an animal might be your dog or cat. Plants might be a holly tree or a tulip. And microorganisms might be bacteria such as, bacteria such as E. coli, which cause illness. It may also include microorganisms that do not cause illness and may actually help you, such as gut microorganisms or gut bacteria. So in addition to animals, plants, and microorganisms, please pause this video for a moment and think if you can come up with any additional living organisms. Two groups of living organisms that are not listed here are fungi, which include things like mushrooms and athlete's foot, and also include a group of organisms known as protist or protozoa, which include some fun things like amoeba and paramecia that we might be able to look at in pond water during the lab portion of the course. The abiotic portion is the non-living portion of the earth. That includes such things as soil, air, water, and sunlight. Please pause for a moment and see if you can think of additional things other than soil, air, water, and sunlight, which constitute part of the abiotic or non-living part of the earth. So one example of an abiotic part of the earth that is not listed here is shown here in the diagram, and that's lightning. In addition, you could further break up water into things like humidity, the water that's in the air, salt water, fresh water, sunlight, temperature, any of those types of things that are not part of the living part of the earth are called abiotic. Just a note here, when you have some vocabulary, bio again meaning living, when the letter A is situated ahead of a word, that means not biotic. So abiotic means not biotic. Okay, now that we've defined biotic and abiotic, we are going to move on to a few more vocabulary terms to help build your basis for the course. This vocabulary term is ecosystem. So first let's look at the roots that make up this word. First is system, a set of interacting components that influence one another by exchanging energy or materials. The word eco comes from the Greek word for house. So when you combine eco and system, you get the living and non-living components of a particular place on Earth. So it's a really broad term, and the main important parts are that it's when living and non-living components are interacting. They are exchanging energy or materials. So let me give you a few examples of ecosystems. An ecosystem might be an aquarium in your home. Okay, that's very small, but it includes components that are living and non-living. It includes the fish, which are living. It may include rocks or other decorations that you have. It may include the amount of oxygen in your tank, which is a non-living component. But together, this little system interacts, and it's an ecosystem. An ecosystem might be slightly larger, such as someone's yard. It could be even larger, such as the campus on Cape Cod Community College. So the whole of Four Seas campus is an ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, there are organisms such as wild turkeys, groundhogs, squirrels, birds, of other kinds other than turkeys, a variety of trees. There are also non-living components such as the parking lots and buildings, the solar panels, etc. And all of these living and non-living components interact with one another. So they make up an ecosystem, the Four Seas campus ecosystem. You can even go larger with an ecosystem. There's no size limit, small or large. So an ecosystem might be, let's say, all of Cape Cod. And within all of Cape Cod, there are a variety of non-living and living components. And doesn't matter, that's still an ecosystem. You can have a really large ecosystem, such as the Serengeti in Africa, which is where the zebra and the wildebeest and the lions live and interact. So that's an example of a very large ecosystem. So again, the important point is not the size of the ecosystem, but that living and non-living components interact at a particular identified place on Earth. So next we're going to look at how humans impact the environment specifically. So we'll start on the next slide. Humans alter natural systems. We've done it for as long as humans have been here. We manipulate and alter our environment more than any other species. And the example here is Los Angeles. On the left is Los Angeles in 1880, and here's a picture of Los Angeles today. You can see that they are dramatically different. So, this is something we will talk about in lecture, but I would like you to take a few minutes to consider how humans have manipulated and altered the environment here compared with what it was. So to give you an example, let's say the paved streets or paving over a great deal of the area here. What impact might that have had on the ecosystem or the environment here? You can probably come up with a few other impacts that building large cities and expansion like this has had. I want you to consider the different animals. I want you to consider resource use. What are we using up when we have so many people in this same original small area? So again, that will be something that we will discuss in class, but that will give you a heads up for now. So next we will look at how scientists monitor the state of the Earth to determine, or to understand rather, the impacts that have been made, for example, between here and here, or impacts to resource use, impacts to other living things, etc. So before I get into that part, which is actually the second bullet point here, let me go up and further describe ecosystem services. So ecosystems or environments provide life-supporting services such as clean water, timber, fisheries, and crops. So let's look at clean water as an example here on Cape Cod. When we have septic systems, which we have prevalently throughout Cape Cod, the septic takes your sewage from your home or apartment and separates it out, spreads it out through something called a leaching field, so the soil surrounding the septic tank. And bacteria in that soil clean up the waste material so that by the time the water reaches either the aquifer, the underground body of drinking water, or an embayment, or a pond, or lake, the water is cleaned up. So that is an example of an ecosystem service. And it only can be successful if we don't overload the system. So now let's step forward and look at environmental indicators. And that's indicators that describe the current state of the environment. So it doesn't tell you what's actually wrong with the environment or what caused it. It's more like taking a temperature with a thermometer. If you take your temperature with a thermometer and you find you have a fever, it tells you that your current state is not okay. But it doesn't tell you what disease you might have. And it may not even be a disease. You can get a fever based on stress even. So an environmental indicator is very similar to a thermometer, which looks at detecting whether there might be an issue in the environment, but doesn't determine what that issue might be. So on the next slide, we'll look at a table which shows environmental indicators in brief, and then we'll move on to another screencast to explain them in more detail. So this is a table from your textbook, and I'm not a big fan of these tables, but I will walk you through it nonetheless. So you can see here in the indicators on the left, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 indicators: biological diversity, food production, average global surface temperature and CO2 concentrations, human population size, and resource depletion. And then they give some very bland trends, outlook for the future, and overall impact on environmental quality. So in the subsequent screencasts, screencast 2 for chapter 1, we will go through each of these in a little bit more detail and explanation than is provided here in the table. So that is it for screencast number 1, chapter 1.